like to thank Students for Peace in Palestine, as well as others in the community that have worked tirelessly to bring such an important speaker to the university today, and also those attending such a vital commentary on one of the greatest humanitarian issues of today. Just real quickly, I'd like to speak about the format of the lecture. Mr. Finkelstein will lecture for about an hour and a half, and then there will be plenty of time for question and answer afterwards, so please save your comments and questions until then. We'll have 2 microphones set up in either aisle, and you'll be able to line up, and we'll alternate between those 2 microphones for questions. It is an honor to introduce one of the most popular figures at the forefront of the struggle against the Israeli occupation. As an academic, historian, author, and activist, Dr. Norman Finkelstein is an inspiration to those who seek to turn their knowledge into action. He uses what he knows, what we all know, about the atrocities of the Israeli occupation to travel the globe and challenge the status quo. Even when it comes at the cost of harsh criticism, Dr. Finkelstein continues to speak his truth and enlightens many on the way. So I encourage you to take Dr. Finkelstein's lecture as more than just that, but also as a call to action. A call to follow in his footsteps as he unveils the injustice that occurs against Palestinians day after day after day. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
But before 2 minutes of our conversation, the person who was driving started to talk about tornadoes. I remember, yes, I've been to Oklahoma, because it's the only state in the Union where people talk about tornadoes when you arrive. And I begin to worry about the miserable fate after a reasonably long life of dying in a tornado in Oklahoma. And I was told that in terms of area size, Oklahoma City. Is that where we are now? Norman is the largest city capital in the country? Area-wise. Everywhere I go, somebody has some superlative where they reside. You had told me you had the most tornadoes per square inch. I would probably believe that one as well. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to be speaking this evening basically on 3 topics, really, to be mathematically precise. I'll be speaking on 2.5 topics. I'll be speaking on what happened in Gaza in 2008, 2009, and then I'll be speaking on what happened in the Mavi Marmara, the Freedom Flotilla, just about a year ago today. For a while I've been speaking of the Gaza events, and I had felt that I was going over ground which no longer required much commentary, because there seemed to be a broad consensus that Israel had done something terrible in Gaza during those 22 days from December 27, 2008 to January 18, 2009. And so I wondered, was there really much point in going through the details? But as it happened, my remarks gained a certain kind of contemporariness, because on April 1st of this year, about 3.5 weeks ago, Richard Goldstone, who had been appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to investigate what Israel had done in Gaza. And he, along with his colleagues, they had produced a fairly massive report on the results of their investigation. The report ran to 575 pages. And it was a quite scathing, you might say, devastating indictment of what Israel had done in Gaza. And Israel had a great deal of difficulty trying to discredit the report. Its conclusions were very harsh. It said, among many other things, that Israel had used deliberately disproportionate force designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. Well, as it happens, many other human rights organizations had also produced quite devastating reports on what Israel had done in Gaza, among them being Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, from which I'll be quoting later in my remarks. But Israel has some well-honed tools which it always takes out of its toolbox whenever it gets harsh criticism. All of you in the room are familiar with those ideological tools or weapons. They say that this organization is anti-Semitic, that organization is Holocaust denying, or something there, some combination thereof. But they had a major problem with Richard Goldstone, the person who headed the UN investigation, because Mr. Goldstone was and still says he's a Zionist, he loves Israel, devoted his entire adult life, among many other things, to Israel. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter had resettled in Israel, and so on and so forth. And so it was not very convincing when Israel said that Richard Goldstone was an anti-Semite and a self-hating Jew, whereas Professor Dershowitz of Harvard said that Richard Goldstone was the equivalent of Mengele, the angel of death, at Auschwitz. These kinds of slanders and ad hominem attacks, they just didn't really stick when it came to Goldstone. And then for about 1.5 years, he came under merciless attack by the organized Jewish community and the state of Israel. Among many low points, pressure was exerted on him to deny him the right to attend his grandson's bar mitzvah in South Africa. He's a South African background. Eventually he was able to attend, but not before an international uproar over the pressures exerted on him. Why do I mention all this? In fact, why do I mention it at the beginning of my remarks? Because on April 1st of this year, as I said about 3.5 weeks ago, Richard Goldstone issued, in effect, a recantation, a taking back of his report in the Washington Post. And at that point, the Israelis, both the government and the citizens of Israel, were jubilant, and they were crowing, "I told you so, we didn't do anything wrong in Gaza," said Prime Minister Netanyahu. "I told you we're one of the most moral armies in the world," said Defense Minister Ehud Barak. "I told you the truth would finally come out, said Avigdor Lieberman. And now they have been freed from the albatross of the Goldstone report. And at that point, the whole controversy erupted again about what did Israel do in Gaza? What did happen? And that's what I'm going to attempt to do today, to reconstruct the record based on a wide range of sources, and then for you to judge on your own, where is the truth? Was it in Richard Goldstone's original indictment of what Israel did, or was it in Richard Goldstone's recantation, his taking back his repudiation of the report in the Washington Post? So that will be my first order of business. And the second order of business is as contemporary and relevant as the first order, because hard as it is for at least me to believe, it's almost now a year since the Israeli attack on the Mavi Marmara, the flagship of the Freedom Flotilla that attempted to breach the blockade of Gaza. So we're not only approaching the year anniversary, but there's something even more relevant for our purposes, namely in about 2.5 weeks' time, unless something changes, there will be a new attempt by a new flotilla of 15 boats to breach the blockade of Gaza for a second time. And so it's certainly useful to have a clear picture of what happened that first time, since Israel predictably claimed it didn't do anything wrong in the case of the flotilla either. And in fact, about 3 or so months ago, maybe a little more, maybe 4 months ago now, they produced a very large report by a former Israeli Supreme Court judge. He headed the commission, a fellow named Mr. Turkle, in which he said that Israel hadn't done anything wrong. So we'll have an opportunity this evening to revisit that episode as well, which is, as I said, very contemporary, very current, because there's a new flotilla, which, unless barring unforeseen circumstances, will be heading towards Gaza in about 2.5 weeks. And finally, I'll speculate on where things are headed, what are the prospects in the near future, and to speak at a minimum length, but at some length, about what's happening now in the Arab world and the prospects there and their likely impact on the Israel-Palestine conflict. The question I'll probably look mostly at is, why has Israel looked with so much dread, or looked upon with so much dread, the changes that have been occurring in the Arab world? What is it that Israel fears so much from the changes that are unfolding? Now, I know at University of Oklahoma, there is one person who's quite knowledgeable in some areas. Is Josh Landis in the audience? Yes. Yeah. So maybe you'll have a chance. I would certainly want to hear what you have to say about what's going on in Syria, and hopefully you'll have a chance to comment. Have you already spoken here before an audience on Syria?
I have.
Okay, well, I'll still, hopefully you'll have a chance to to say something during the questions and answers because I hear so many mixed things about people's hopes and fears when it comes to what's happening in Syria. Well, as I said, I'm going to begin with Gaza 2008, but actually the story goes further back. If you wanted to pick, I think, the right starting point would be May 2000, when after a 17-year-long guerrilla war, the Hezbollah, the army of God, it evicted Israel, which had been occupying South Lebanon. Israel was forced to withdraw, to return to its legal border, and for Israel this was a major catastrophe, the fact that it had suffered a military defeat. It worried that what it calls its deterrence capacity is just a fancy technical term for the Arab Muslim world's fear of Israel. Israel worried that its deterrence capacity had been significantly compromised by the Hezbollah victory. And so already from, you could say, 2001, Israel was preparing for round 2 against the party of God. They waited patiently for a pretext, patiently for an alibi, an excuse to go in and attempt to inflict a defeat on the Hezbollah. And that alibi, that excuse came in the summer of 2006. Israel went into Lebanon again, inflicted massive death and destruction, killed about 1,200 Lebanese, of whom about 1,000 were civilians, inflicted massive destruction on the Lebanese infrastructure, destroying the bridges, indiscriminate assaults on the civilian infrastructure generally. But on the battlefield, Israel suffered another major military defeat, the second consecutive one. And now the Israelis were very upset because not only had they suffered 2 consecutive defeats at the hands of the Hezbollah, but the leader of the Hezbollah, Sayed Nasrallah, was not shy about rubbing it into the faces of Israel that, as he said, the Arab Muslim world no longer fears it. And he would periodically taunt the Israelis and say, if you want to attack, attack. And just as we defeated you before, we're going to defeat you again. And now Israel faced the dilemma. It had to find a way of restoring its deterrence capacity, restoring the Arab Muslim world's fear of it. They couldn't go yet into Lebanon again because they weren't confident that in a test on the battlefield they would come out on top. They contemplated attacking Iran along with the United States, but the U.S. vetoed that proposal. And so Israel turned to its favorite shooting gallery. It turned to Gaza, and it prepared for an assault on Gaza to restore the Arab Muslim world's fear of it. But the Israelis had a problem, and the problem was everybody knew that Hamas was not a significant fighting force. So if Israel defeated Hamas militarily, it really wasn't going to impress anybody. So the dilemma for Israel was, how do you restore your deterrence capacity how do you restore the Arab-Muslim world's fear of you against a foe which was not a significant military force? And Israel resolved that dilemma by saying that it was going, or planning, to go in and inflict so much death and destruction, to carry on, as Israeli officials said, to carry on in a lunatic fashion, to carry on in a crazy fashion, to, as Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister of Israel at the time, as she put it, to go wild in Gaza. Or she put it, to carry on like real hooligans in Gaza. That's Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister. To go crazy, to carry on in a lunatic fashion, to go wild, to carry on like hooligans, and in that way to transmit the message to the Arab-Muslim world that if you mess with us, if you lift your heads too high, we're not going to defeat you on the battlefield. We're going to just destroy everything in sight. And that's what they set out to do in Gaza, or again, to quote the Goldstone report, to use deliberately disproportionate force designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, with the emphasis here on civilian population, because Israel recognized that militarily a victory over Gaza or over Hamas would not impress anyone. The immediate background to the assault goes something like this. In January 2006, there were parliamentary elections in the occupied Palestinian territories. And surprisingly, it was Hamas, the Islamic movement, that came out victorious. Our former U.S. President, Jimmy Carter, he was one of the international observers at the elections, and he said they were completely honest and fair. In reaction to these completely honest and fair elections, Israel and the United States imposed economic sanctions on the people of Gaza to punish them for having elected the wrong government into power. In the United States, that's called democracy promotion. About a year and a half later, there was an attempted coup orchestrated by the U.S., Israel, and some elements among the Palestinians to overthrow the legally elected Hamas government. The coup was unsuccessful. Hamas foiled it. And at that point, Israel and the United States, followed soon thereafter by the EU, the European Union, they imposed, or I should say, they tightened the blockade of Gaza. Amnesty International had said this blockade is a flagrant violation of international law because it's punishing the civilian population. And that constitutes a form of collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. The former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza at this point, and she said, Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Its whole civilization has been destroyed. In June 2008, Egypt brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And each side had obligations under the ceasefire. Hamas it was obliged to stop its rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. And Israel, it was obliged to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. The blockade, which was a flagrant violation of international law. The blockade that was destroying a civilization. Now, according to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now I'm quoting it, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel reneged on its obligation to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. In fact, exactly at this time, when Israel had made a formal commitment to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza, Israel was reporting to the U.S. representatives in Jerusalem. Israel was reporting on multiple occasions that it was trying to bring the economy of Gaza to the brink of collapse. So while it was publicly pledged to lift the blockade, privately it was conceding to the Americans, and in fact, we're not lifting a blockade. We intend to bring the economy of Gaza to the brink of collapse. What happened next? It's not controversial. All you have to do is open up Amnesty International's yearbook for 2009. And if you open to the entry for Israel and the Palestinian territories, you'll read, a ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. It held for 4.5 months. But it broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on November 4th. Israel had been preparing for its assault on Gaza from at least as early as March 2007. And when all the pieces were in place, when it was ready to attack, it needed an excuse. It needed a pretext. It needed an alibi. So it patiently waited for November 4th, our election day, when it knew that the full attention of the media and the American people would be riveted to the result of the historic election in the U.S. And on that day, it invaded Gaza and killed 6 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that by killing these militants, Hamas would resume its rocket and mortar attacks. But it wasn't only that Israel knew Hamas would resume its rocket and mortar attacks. Israel wanted Hamas to resume the rocket and mortar attacks because it needed the pretext to launch the assault on Gaza. Whenever there are references nowadays to what happened, every reference begins the same way. It always says, with no exceptions, it always says that Israel invaded Gaza in order to stop the rocket and mortar attacks. But if Israel wanted to stop the rocket and mortar attacks, all it had to do was abide by the terms of the ceasefire. As Amnesty said, the ceasefire held for 4.5 months, but it broke down after Israel entered Gaza on November 4th and killed the Palestinian militants. But you know those Muslims, you know those Islamists, they're so irrational, they're crazy. They just do the most irrational things. And so Hamas kept saying until the end of December, we're ready to renew the ceasefire. We want to renew the ceasefire. But Israel has to meet its obligations under the terms of the ceasefire. It has to lift the blockade of Gaza. Israel said no. Israel said that Hamas had to stop its rocket and mortar attacks, but it wouldn't lift the blockade. By the end of December, Sarah Roy of Harvard University, the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, she also happens to be the daughter of a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp. Sarah Roy wrote, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us in Gaza, but there is little international response beyond UN warnings, which are ignored." And now the people of Gaza, Hamas, they were confronted with two stark options. One, they could acquiesce in their gradual but inevitable destruction as a people. Or two, they could resist. Hamas chose to resist, although it must be said that the resistance was largely symbolic. The former Israeli commander in Gaza, speaking to his own people, he said, "You cannot just land blows leave the Palestinians in Gaza in economic distress and expect that Hamas would just sit around and do nothing." It's easy enough to condemn Hamas for the rocket and mortar attacks on Israel, and all the human rights organizations did so. Some actually think it's a badge of bravery and courage to denounce Hamas's rocket and mortar attacks. But if you do denounce those rocket and mortar attacks, it seems you also have the obligation to say, okay, what should Hamas have done? What was the alternative? What was the other option? If you don't present the alternative, if you don't present the other option, then you're in effect saying that the people of Gaza had a legal and moral obligation to just lie still and die. As it happens, Israel decided to expedite the process, to speed it up, and on December 27th, it invaded Gaza. The invasion lasted 22 days, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction. Well, what happened during those 22 days? Nowadays, when people refer back, they refer to the Gaza war. Even reputable human rights organizations, the standard usage now is to refer to the war in Gaza, the Gaza war. Israel is very emphatic that there was a war in Gaza, and they were very emphatic and proud of the outcome, because they had now shown those Arabs and Muslims who's who and what's what in this corner of the world. They reminded the rest of the Arab Muslim world who's in charge. And how did they do that? How did they achieve that goal? Well, the Israelis said, we won the war in Gaza. We won the war in Gaza. But then along came an Israeli strategic analyst, and he said it's very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days of fighting. Well, if there was no war in Gaza, if there wasn't a single battle fought in Gaza, what then did happen? On a military level, it's pretty straightforward, not very complicated. The Israeli statistics there's no reason to doubt them. It began with what they called the air phase of the campaign. And by the end of the 22 days, Israel had flown between 2,800 and 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. Every plane returned. Not a single plane was down, not a single plane was damaged, which is not altogether too surprising because Hamas had no anti-aircraft defenses to speak of. After the first week, on January 3rd, Israel launched what they called the ground and air phase of the offensive, of the campaign. The Israeli soldiers had special night warfare equipment. Hamas couldn't even see them, let alone tangle with them. So, what did happen in Gaza? Not a single battle, no planes down, no planes damaged. Hamas couldn't even see the Israeli soldiers, let alone tangle with them. So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, we have a pretty clear picture. And 10,000 recantations by Richard Goldstone can't change this evidence, because the evidence comes from what one might want to call an unimpeachable source. It's the Israeli soldiers themselves. After the attack on Gaza, many Israeli soldiers came forward to give public witness to what they personally experienced. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns. Except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course. Not a soul. Soldier, go ahead, ask the other soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing. No one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entering Gaza. There just wasn't any. Sounds sort of surreal. It's kind of funny. A war with only one side. And it is funny. It's absolutely hilarious. Until you hear the other half. And if you want to check for yourself, all you have to do is go to your computers and enter under the URL, breaking the silence. And if you enter breaking the silence, what will come up on your screen is one of the collections of testimonies of the Israeli soldiers. And then all you have to do with the search function is enter the word insane. And if you enter the word insane, it comes up once, twice, 3 times. The soldiers were interviewed separately, so they weren't cueing each other, but the same word keeps leaping to the mind of soldier after soldier. Insane, says soldier 1. Insane, says soldier 2. Insane, says soldier 3. Soldier 4, insane. Soldier 5, insane. Soldier 6 is saying, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza, says the first soldier. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza, says the second soldier. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza, says the third soldier, the fourth soldier, the fifth soldier, the sixth soldier. No battles, no enemy in the field. They couldn't even see Hamas. It was boring, except that Israel was using insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. This was firepower such as I had never known, said a soldier. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking. Another soldier, on the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that actually rocked the outpost, to the extent that some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse. The Israeli army enters Gaza, commandeers the Palestinian homes. They're firing into the horizon. But these insane amounts of firepower are causing the ground underneath them to quake. So they're told to abandon the houses where they're staying. So what did happen in Gaza? Ehud Barak said, you see, we showed you. We're one of the most moral armies in the world. Avigdor Lieberman said, we knew the truth would finally come out. Mr. Netanyahu said, we've done nothing wrong in Gaza. So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, the Israeli soldiers came up with the most revealing analogies. One soldier said, it felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game. Another soldier said, you felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. You felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. Well, that sure as heck sounds like one of the most moral armies in the world. The soldier was not engaging in poetic exaggeration. The technical term is hyperbole. The soldier was being literal. He felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. One of the substances Israel used in Gaza, which it invariably uses in its encounters with its Arab neighbors, is the white phosphorus. I never paid much attention to the details of the white phosphorus. It had an ominous sounding name. But this time I did look at the details. White phosphorus, it reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As Ms. Oprah might say, try wrapping your mind around that one. Judging by the recent pictures of Oprah on the cover of her magazine, I think she could wrap her waist around that. I haven't watched television since All in the Family, and people say I don't connect enough with popular culture. So whenever I'm in the supermarket, I look at the cover of O, so I can connect. I can see from my comment it clearly resonates with much of the audience. Much more so than I made allusions to Archie Bunker. How many people know who he is? Oh, okay. So I'm still with it. So, what did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Human Rights Watch put out a report entitled Rain of Fire. And this is what they had to say. Israel repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. It dropped the white phosphorus on a school. It dropped the white phosphorus on a marketplace. It dropped the white phosphorus on a humanitarian aid warehouse. It dropped the white phosphorus on 2 hospitals in Gaza, Al-Quds Hospital and Al-Wafa Hospital. According to Human Rights Watch, the hospitals were clearly marked, and it does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. Oh, that's one of the most moral armies in the world. By the end of the 22 days, 1,400 Palestinians were dead, of whom up to 4/5 were civilians. 350 were children. On the Israeli side, 13 Israelis were killed, of whom 3 were civilians, 10 were combatants, and of the 10 combatants, 4 of the 10 were killed in accidents by other Israelis, the technical term being friendly fire. So, for every 100 Palestinians killed, 1 Israeli was killed. For every 400 Palestinian civilians killed, 1 Israeli civilian was killed. Now you have to use your judgment. You have to use your capacity for independent thought. 100 to 1, 400 to 1. Does that sound like a war? Or does that sound like a massacre? Every time you hear anyone refer to the Gaza war, he or she has, intentionally or not, wittingly or not, he or she has become an agent of Israeli propaganda. There was no war in Gaza. There was a massacre in Gaza. But the Israelis are very reasonable. They always have explanations. They're always trying to explain, because they believe that their explanations, if understood, will exonerate them of guilt and responsibility. And so they had an explanation. Everybody in this room knows their explanation. They said, well, if there were a lot of deaths in Gaza, a lot of civilians killed, it wasn't our fault. Because you know those Muslims, they're not just crazy, they're cowards. They hid behind the Palestinian civilians, used the civilians as human shields. And so even though it broke our hearts and caused us anguish, we couldn't help but kill the civilians because Hamas was hiding behind them. So if I were to ask this audience, how many of you are familiar with the claim that Hamas was using Palestinian civilians as human shields? So raise your hand. How many are familiar with that claim? Raise your hand up high. So it's nearly everyone in the room. You'd have to be brain dead or making excessive use of mind-altering drugs not to have heard that claim. It was so widely reported and repeated. This is the University of Oklahoma, so we can be fairly certain that there's nobody in this room that's brain dead. as to making excessive use of mind-altering drugs. I'm listening carefully for the nervous laughter, looking for the nervous smiles. It's like about 25%. Are you laughing because that's a conservative estimate? I know it is. I know it's 60%. 60, yeah. Actually, I don't think the real problem is the mind-altering drugs. I don't. I think the real problem is the prescription drugs. I think your generation is a complete mess. It's a very terrible problem that your generation, starting like second grade, you're on the Ritalin and all those drugs for your EDHEFQRCD, whatever you've been diagnosed with. And then you're in junior high school and you're already on the recreational drugs. By the time you're in high school, your brains are scrambled eggs. It's very, very, I think, ominous what's happening. In any event, all the human rights organizations, they investigate the claim of whether Hamas had engaged in human shielding. Because if it were true, obviously it would significantly shift the burden of legal responsibility for the deaths that occurred. And believe it or not, by now, by one credible estimate, there have been about 300 human rights reports written on what happened in Gaza. And they all investigate this claim of human shielding because it was Israel's main alibi. And if it were true, obviously, Israel's guilt would be substantially reduced. So if I were to ask this gentleman over here, well, what's the most respected human rights organization in the world? You would answer, Amnesty International in Nobel laureates. And among the human rights organizations, it also exhaustively investigated the allegation of human shielding. And let me quote to you then verbatim, so I can't be accused of misrepresenting in my paraphrase what they have to say. Amnesty. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. It didn't happen. Now here's the interesting question. This audience is not a typical cross-section of the American public. You are more interested in the conflict and therefore more knowledgeable about the topic than your average American. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here this evening. And I think it's fair to say that the preponderance of people in this room, you might even say the overwhelming majority, would describe themselves as, to use the term, pro-Palestinian. So we have an audience here that's biased in favor of the Palestinians, as well as an audience which is more than typically knowledgeable on the topic. And so here's the interesting question. How many people in this audience are aware that every human rights organization that investigated the question came to the same conclusion? They could find no evidence that Hamas had engaged in human shielding in Gaza. Honestly, raise your hand if you were aware of that. Look around you. I count 2 people. Well, I think that's an interesting fact. It tells you about the amount of disinformation and misinformation about the most basic facts on what happened. And even people who think they're knowledgeable have been subjected to. Amnesty went one step further. Amnesty said, even if it were true that Hamas engaged in human shielding, they said it's not true, but even if it were true, it couldn't explain the overwhelming number of deaths in Gaza. Why? Well, here's what Amnesty had to say. In the Israeli attacks that caused the greatest number of Palestinian fatalities and injuries, the Palestinian victims were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, nor were the Palestinian civilian victims shielding militants or other legitimate targets. So the Palestinians were not caught in the crossfire, and they weren't shielding Hamas fighters. How did they die? And here's what Amnesty had to say. Many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. That sounds pretty moral. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. That sounds pretty moral. How did children die in Gaza? How did 350 children die in Gaza? Amnesty says the children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. At the end of 22 days, on January 18, Israel partially withdrew from Gaza and created a buffer zone which absorbed about 30% of Palestinian farmland. But it had partially withdrawn. And Israel knew it wasn't going to reoccupy Gaza, so it wanted to make sure that when it left, it would make the life of the people of Gaza even more wretched than it had been when they entered. So all the human rights organizations reported that Israel used indiscriminate force in Gaza. It's fired everywhere. And that's true under international law. The use of indiscriminate force in civilian areas is a war crime. And not even Richard Goldstone retracted that part of his original report, as the evidence is overwhelming. But it's not true that Israel only used indiscriminate force. It also used very discriminate force because it wanted to make sure that the lives of the people would be yet more wretched when they left Gaza. So, for example, Gaza had only one operative flour mill, the El Badr flour mill. There had been 3 others, but those 3 others were no longer functioning because Israel was blocking the entry of spare parts to repair them. And during the attack in Gaza, Israel destroyed the El Badr flour mill to make sure the people of Gaza would be deprived of their most basic staple. Gaza had 29 ready-mix cement factories. Israel destroyed 22 of the 29 ready-mix cement factories to make sure the people of Gaza could not rebuild after they withdrew. Israel was, until this day continues, to block cement from entering Gaza, but it also wanted to make sure that the people of Gaza couldn't make their own cement, and so that it couldn't rebuild. And there was something to rebuild. Israel left behind 600,000 tons of rubble. 600,000 tons of rubble. Well, the months passed, January 2008, February 2008, March 2008, and a humanitarian crisis began to unfold in Gaza. And in May 2008, as I said, in May 2010, a new flotilla of boats, there had been several before, a new flotilla of boats was organized in order to try to breach the blockade of Gaza, in order to bring humanitarian supplies, and also to establish the principle that nobody had the right to impose collective punishment on the people of Gaza. Well, Israel said, there's no need for this flotilla. They said, there's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But then the human rights organizations, they said, that's not true. The International Committee of the Red Cross said the blockade of Gaza is having a devastating impact on the 1.5 million people living there. Israel said, that's not true. That's an exaggeration. They said, it's true there's hunger in Gaza. We'll concede that. But there's no starvation in Gaza. And insofar as there's no starvation, Israel said, there's no humanitarian crisis. But then the humanitarian organizations, they said, but under international law, starvation is defined as causing hunger. And now you had this kind of strange debate going on with the humanitarian organizations saying that Israel had put the people of Gaza on a starvation diet. And Israel saying, not true. We put them on a starvation plus diet. And in the midst of this strange debate, the most basic fact got lost. Namely, what right did Israel have to put the people of Gaza on any diet? Well, even Israel's harshest critics, even Israel's sternest critics, they said, we agree with Israel on one point. Namely, Israel does have the right to prevent weapons from entering Gaza. But that's not altogether clear. International law is neutral on the question of whether peoples fighting for self-determination have the right to use armed force in order to achieve their self-determination. It's neither legal nor illegal under international law. It's neutral. Insofar as Palestinians have the right to use armed force, and as the letter B follows the letter A, they obviously have the right to receive weapons in order to use armed force to achieve their independence. Now, some of you are no doubt thinking, why are we going there? Why are we talking about armed force? Why are we talking about weapons? Aren't we here to try to achieve peace, a peaceful settlement? And actually, my sympathies tend also in that direction. It's way too easy from Norman, Oklahoma, or by Norman in Brooklyn, in New York, to talk about armed force and death It's too easy. But even those who are appalled by the prospects of armed force and the death that naturally ensues, the international community was saying was still completely hypocritical. Because as Amnesty International pointed out in a report entitled Fueling Conflict, Amnesty said, under international law and domestic American law, Amnesty said it's illegal to transfer weapons to a party, whether a state or a non-state actor, that's a consistent violator of human rights. So Amnesty said, yes, it's true. It's illegal to transfer weapons to Hamas because it's a consistent violator of human rights. But then Amnesty went on to say it's also illegal to transfer weapons to Israel because Israel is a consistent violator of human rights. To the extent that the international community said Israel had the right to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza, but didn't also say that we have an obligation to prevent weapons from reaching Israel. The international community, even Israel's harshest critics, were being completely hypocritical. Not by my standard, not even by Amnesty standard. That just happens to be the law, both international law and domestic American law. Well, on May 31st at 4:26 a.m., Israel launched its assault on the Freedom Flotilla, the flotilla of boats that was trying to breach the blockade of Gaza. And we'll probably never know what happened during those fateful hours, mostly because Israel confiscated all the photographic and video evidence of the passengers aboard the Freedom Flotilla and only released those snippets that served its purposes. But in fact, the details are not all that important because the basic picture we all know, and the basic picture is not open to serious dispute. Number one, Israel was imposing a blockade on Gaza. Number two, the blockade was causing a humanitarian crisis. Number three, the blockade was directed against the civilian population of Gaza. Number four, Israel was knowingly directing the blockade against the civilian population of Gaza. Number five, that constitutes collective punishment under international law, which means number six, the blockade was illegal, which means number seven, Israel had no right to use force to enforce an illegal blockade. End of story. But no, not with the Israelis. It's never the end of the story, because they always have explanations. Because they're so reasonable. And they produce this large report running to nearly 300 pages by, as I mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Turco, a former member of the Israeli Supreme Court. And this was a very erudite report. It had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. There were more footnotes in that report than there were cockroaches in my apartment in Washington Heights in Manhattan. And that's a lot of footnotes. I keep a spotless apartment, but it was uncontrollable. They entered every orifice of your body at night. Yes. If you're one of those people who sleeps at night with your mouth open, don't rent an apartment in Washington Heights. I won't even go to the other orifices. I'll leave that to your perverted imaginations. So, the Turkle Report, with its vast number of erudite footnotes, it said, it's not true what the international community is saying. Because, first of all, there was no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's just hunger. But then they said that even if civilians were harmed by the blockade, even if civilians were harmed, it wasn't our intention. It was unintentional. Everybody knows that in war, civilians are often unintentionally harmed. What do we call that when civilians are unintentionally harmed? What? Yes, collateral damage. And so Israel said, we didn't want to harm the civilians in Gaza, but it was collateral damage. They said what we wanted to do, we just wanted to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza. But while trying to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza, unintentionally, civilians were hurt. Collateral damage. And that makes perfect sense. How can you quarrel with that? So, among the things that Israel barred from entering Gaza, they barred the entry of chocolate. They barred the entry of potato chips. They barred the entry of baby chicks. Now, who here would dare deny the lethal potential of chips and chicks? You like that alliteration? As it happens, the Human Rights Commission, it appointed a high-level mission to investigate what happened on the Mavi Marmara. The Human Rights Commission has no point in trying to defend the indefensible. It's a complete joke. I agree with that. But it happens that when they appoint investigative bodies, they pick people of very high caliber. That's also factually correct. Richard Goldstone was a jurist of international stature. And in the same way, the people who they picked to investigate what happened in the Mavi Marmara were exceptionally qualified individuals. They produced a large report, and their main conclusions were that Israel launched the attack on the Mavi Marmara, the flagship of the Freedom Flotilla. They launched the attack using stun grenades, tear gas, and Navy plastic bullets. That when the passengers aboard the boat repelled the Israeli attack, the helicopters came in about 5 minutes later, and according to the Human Rights Commission, the helicopters were firing live ammunition at the passengers on the boat before any of the Israeli commandos had reached the deck of the Mavi Marmara. By the end of the Israeli assault, 9 passengers were killed. Of those 9, 5 of them were shot in the head. All but 1 of them suffered multiple bullet wounds, and 6 of them, according to the Human Rights Commission, 6 of them were victims of summary, arbitrary, extrajudicial executions, which is the fancy way of words to say they were murdered in cold blood. Israel said that's not true. They devoted a couple of 100 pages to proving it was not true in the Turco report. They said, in fact, the Israeli commandos, they exercised maximum restraint, and they only used lethal force as a last resort. Well, they used lethal force as a last resort, and they exercised maximum restraint. How did those 9 passengers get killed? How did it come to pass that 5 of them were shot in the head? All of them had multiple bullet wounds, except one. How did that happen? Well, the Turco Commission, they had an explanation. It's very reasonable. The explanation goes like this. There were several 100 passengers on the Mavi Marmara. Among those several 100, there were about 40 to 100 crazed Islamic jihadis. And these crazed Islamic jihadis, they had been planning from the get-go to attack the Israeli armed forces. And so even though all the other passengers had been checked, x-rayed, and frisked before boarding the Mavi Marmara for weapons, these crazed Islamic jihadis, we call them CIJs for short, these CIJs, they managed to get on the Mavi Marmara without being frisked or x-rayed. And they brought on board this vast weapons cache because they were going to take on the Israeli army, the 4th most powerful military force in the world. And then the Turco report, it listed the weapons they brought on board. And it was a terrifying inventory, if I might say so. They brought on board 200 knives, 20 axes. Some of you might laugh, but I remember my Little Red Riding Hood, and I remember that axe at the end by the woodsman, right? He chopped off the wolf's head or something. In any case, when I saw axes, the shivers went down my spine. But then I turned 3 pages later, the same report, and it said the boat had 200 kitchen knives. Oh, so the knives that were brought on board, they were being brought on board to cut butter. And then it said the boat had 20 axes as part of the fire extinguishing equipment. Well, that explains the knives, check. And that explains the axes, check. So what else did they bring on board? Because they were plotting to take on the 4th most powerful military force in the world. According to the Turco report, they brought on slingshots and glass marbles. Slingshots and glass marbles. I read that, and immediately I thought, my Yiddish, anybody know the word meshuggah? Sugar is Yiddish for crazy. I thought to myself, these jihadis are meshuggah. You're going to take on the most powerful military force in the world. You can bring on anything. Because you're not being frisked, you're not being x-rayed, you're not being checked. They didn't bring on a tank. They could have brought on a couple of neutron bombs. All they could have ordered was slingshots and glass bottles. It didn't seem to make sense to me. But then there was another thing that didn't make sense. As some of you will recall, the passengers on the boat, they managed to capture 3 of the Israeli commandos. And the commandos who were captured, they testified in vivid detail before the Turco Commission. And they said that these jihadis, they had hate burned in their eyes. They wanted to kill us. Yeah. I thought to myself, because I'm a very naive reader, I thought to myself, but wait. You said they had hate burned in their eyes. And you said they wanted to kill you. And they also said these jihadis were big and burly. They were like the Muslim version of Mr. T. You know Mr. T? So I'm figuring big, burly, crazed Islamic jihadis who want to kill the commandos. So how did it come to pass that the commandos were just taken care of and then released? Why didn't they kill them? They had them in their custody. But you know, the Israelis are very reasonable. They have an explanation for everything. And here's how they explained it. They said, yes, there were the big, burly, crazed Islamic jihadis. But there were also the older, grayer peaceniks on the boat. And the peaceniks prevented the jihadis from killing the commandos. So that made perfect sense. Who here is going to dispute that? You had the big, burly, crazed Islamic jihadis burning with hate, wanting to kill the commandos, and these CIJs, they were stopped dead in their tracks by Grannies for Peace and the Birkenstock Brigade. Makes sense. Well, I'm going to cut my remarks a little short because I went on at some length. And I'm going to now, I know what this is going to say. It's going to say, we won the Oscar. And I'm going to just come to the end now and leave time for the questions and answers, because I'm gratified to see, and I mean it truly, that strange as it may sound, in Norman, Oklahoma, it's one of the most diverse audiences I've seen in a long time. And that's a good thing. And so I want to have a chance to interact with the people here. I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in a public way for now nearly 30 years. I started in June 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And most of you have no memory of that. Between June 1982 and September, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians. And I've I've been with it for nearly 30 years. And it's a very sobering thought, I have to tell you, to see your whole life pass before your eyes and to realize that you've devoted it to this tiny pinprick on the world's map, Israel and Palestine. There's this vast breadth of human knowledge and depth to human knowledge, a tiny portion of which I managed to sample in college and in graduate school. But as I got older and as the years elapsed, I began to focus more and more laser-like on this Israel-Palestine conflict. Occasionally taking a digression here or there, I managed to read through several tens of thousands of pages of Gandhi a couple of years ago. Mostly it's been Israel, Palestine, all the time. And you sometimes have to wonder whether it was worth a life's investment. You take the whole of Israel's population, 7.5 million people. You add to it the population of the occupied Palestinian territories, another 4 million people. You throw in the Palestinian refugees, you throw in those Jews who still think Israel is their homeland. You take the whole figure, you add it all up. You don't even get one housing project in one block of Shanghai. The buildings are very tall. And so you wonder whether the whole thing was worth it. There are moments of despair, no question about it. I was very despairing when Richard Goldstone issued his recantation. There are many moments where you feel like it's hopeless, but then there are also moments where, out of the blue, there's hope. And certainly, like many of you in this room, I was glued to I don't watch television, but I was glued to my computer following the developments beginning in Tunisia and then spreading to Egypt. And now things have gotten murky. It's hard to know where they will go, what the outcome will be. But there is, I think, there is a large amount of reason to hope. And the main reason there is to hope, in addition to the positive developments in the Arab world, public opinion has significantly changed. Internationally and also in the United States, Israel's having a lot of trouble making its case known. People are less and less convinced of the Israeli version of events, and even there's a lot of doubts being expressed inside the Jewish community, in particular among younger Jews. Jews as an ethnic group, they tend to be very liberal in their political convictions. The last presidential election, 80% of American Jews voted for Barack Obama, which was incidentally a much higher percentage than Latinos who voted for Barack Obama. Latinos was about 63%. Now, Jews are by far and away the richest religious ethnic group in the United States. So they were voting with their pocketbooks. They should have been voting Republican. Certainly a lot more so than Latinos, who are among the poorest ethnic groups in the United States. But no, Jews are liberal. They voted for Barack Obama. And being liberal in the American context means believing in the rule of law, believing in equality under the law, believing in the peaceful resolution of conflicts, being opposed to war in general, And so American Jews, in particular younger American Jews, are having much more difficulty reconciling their liberal convictions with the way Israel carries on. If you're a liberal, a young Jewish person at a university like Oklahoma, you just don't want to be put in the position of having to defend something like dropping white phosphorus in a hospital. If you're Rush Limbaugh, if you're Sean Hannity, if you're Sarah Palin, or God forbid, you're Mr. Inhofe, then of course, you have no trouble trying to defend actions or conduct like the way Israel carried on in Gaza. But if you're Jewish and you live room, no, you don't want to go there. And so support or blind support for Israel is breaking up. And so there's real, in my opinion, there's real reason to be hopeful that we can achieve a just and lasting settlement within the foreseeable future. And it basically requires of us, in my opinion, two things. Number one, we have to be principled. And principled is not an abstract concept. Principled has a concrete meaning. It means that we have to support all the rights to which Palestinians are entitled under international law. Under international law, the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and the whole of East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories. And so under international law, Israel has to withdraw from the territories it occupied in June 1967. That's the law. Under international law, the Palestinian refugees from 1948 have the right of return and compensation. That's the law. And so being principled means that we should support the Palestinians in the rights to which they're entitled under the law. We should be principled. Nobody has the right to tell Palestinians that they should forfeit any of their rights in the interest of achieving a peace. No. If you're not willing to support the Palestinians in their rights, then, to put it crudely, you should shut up. And you shouldn't be counseling Palestinians about what rights they should have to forfeit. If they want to forfeit this right or that right, of course, nobody has to exercise all their rights. I have a right to play golf and to go bowling, but I don't golf and I don't bowl. Anyone can forfeit their rights, but nobody has the right to tell them that they have to forfeit their rights. That's being principled. But while we're being principled, we also have to be reasonable. We have to show the Israelis and their supporters that this conflict can be resolved. It doesn't have to go on through eternity. There is a way to resolve it that preserves everybody's dignity, everybody's self-respect. There is a way. Nobody is being asked to forfeit any of their rights. We have to show the Israelis and their supporters there's a way out, so they won't feel as if they're pinned against the wall and their only option is to strike out blindly. If we're principled and we're reasonable, I think the conflict can be resolved. It's possible, as some of you know, the late Professor Edward Said. How many people remember him here? Okay, it's a good showing. Professor Said, he used to like to quote the Caribbean poet M.A. Cesar, and the line he liked to quote was, "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." I like that line not only because of its poetic quality, but because we normally think of victory as there being a victor and a vanquished. But Said, quoting M.A. Cesar, he doesn't say that. He says there's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. No victor, no vanquished. Just be reasonable. Be fair. Does it sound right that everything in Gaza is okay because the people aren't starving? They're just going to bed hungry at night? 60% of the population of Gaza is under 18 years of age. So it's okay what's going on in Gaza because 750,000 children are not starving. They're just going to bed hungry at night. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? Just be fair. Just be reasonable. And there's room for everyone at that rendezvous of victory. Now, I don't know how I'm going to get there. My bones are creaking a little now after many years of jogging, and so it's unlikely I'm going to be jogging to that rendezvous. And I may be walking, not a power walk, because I find those power walks pretty tough. There were 2 women today in the boardwalk, and they were power walking, and I was trying to jog. I live by Coney Island Boardwalk. And they said, I kept going ahead of them and behind them. You're neither here nor there. They yelled at me, make up your mind. I was trying to get ahead of them because of my ego. But I couldn't keep up the power walk, so I kept lagging behind. So it's unlikely I'm going to be jogging to that rendezvous of victory. I don't know if I'm going to be walking. I don't know if I'm going to be limping. I don't know if I'm going to be using a cane. Maybe a wheelchair. It may be a stretcher with light supports. Those big, burly jihadis holding the forehead. I don't know. But I'm determined to get to that rendezvous of victory. But there's one hitch. That is, I can't get there unless all of you are there with me. It ain't going to happen. Because the other side has lots of money and lots of power and lots of influence. And it's ruthless. And the only thing we have are our bodies and our goodness and decency. And the only way we're going to reach that rendezvous of victory is if we combine and collect our goodness and decency in our bodies and do it together. Some of you, maybe a few of you, know the folk singer Pete Seeger. How many of you have heard of him? Raise your hand. Not bad. Look around the room. Now you know how many people in this room are over 80 years old. Well, Pete's a national treasure. He was in the 20th century, he was on the right side of all the great causes, which means he was on the left side. Some of you know him from the song, Where have all the fires gone? How many of you know that? Not too many. How many know, if I had a hammer? Raise your hand. That's Pete. How many know turn, turn, turn? More. Those are all by Pete. And Pete was recently interviewed for his 92nd birthday. And he began talking about his old friend who's no longer with us, a guy named Yip Harburg. Who here knows Yip Harburg? Over 100. You were great for your age. Now, even though none of you know Yip by name, except one person, you all know him by his legacy. Because Yip Harburg wrote the lyrics and the music for all the songs in The Wizard of Oz. Now, who knows The Wizard of Oz? We're making progress. Maybe we're making regress, but okay. In any case, Pete said, I always had a bone to pick, a difference with Yip on the song Over the Rainbow. Because the last lyric of the song goes, bluebirds can do it, fly over the rainbow. And then Dorothy says, why, oh why can't I? Bluebirds can do it, get over the rainbow. But why, oh why can't I? And Pete said, because Dorothy, it's not all about you. Why, oh, why can't I? Pete said, what Dorothy should have been asking is, why can't you and I? Why can't you and I? And that's the message to you. If we want to get over the rainbow, it's got to be all of us together. If we want to reach that rendezvous victory, it's got to be all of us together. Because it's not going to just be there. Questions?
Yeah, we'll have a microphone right here and right over there. Also, if you need to take a minute to pray, the president's room is cleared. If you go straight out this way and to the left, but we're going to go ahead and start question and answers in this aisle as well as this one.
Let's just give 1 minute for people to exit. I think we're fine now. Go ahead.
Okay, so.
Sure.
Okay. In January of this year, there was a large meeting with the Palestine paper, the Elser, and the Guardian news organizations. And I wanted you to tell us what those were and what you think their significance is.
The question that's being asked is about the papers that were leaked to Al Jazeera, who came to be called the Palestine papers. I have to say it was and the question was, what's the significance of them? I have to say it was a very large number of documents, and three things occurred simultaneously. There were the WikiLeaks documents, the Palestine paper documents, and the Turco Commission report. And it was very hard to keep up with all of them. And I decided to put off the Palestine papers till this summer. I understand it's now coming out as a book by Clayton Fisher. So it's going to simplify matters now. I start printing it out, and it was just taken through an eternity. The basic picture, I think, is fairly straightforward, and I'll just comment broadly. The Palestine Papers dealt basically with the negotiations between the Palestinian Authority, so-called Palestinian Authority, and Israel. And the papers seem to indicate, though I haven't read them in detail, that the Palestinians had made kinds of concessions in the negotiations, which went well beyond what people had publicly understood the position of the Palestinian Authority to be. The basic points I would make are twofold, if you'll allow me. Number one, there never has been, there isn't now, and there won't be for the foreseeable future, a peace process. That's not rhetoric. It's what a rational person, the conclusion a rational person reaches after looking at the record. Rational people, they judge not by words, but they judge by results and outcomes. And so what are the results and outcomes? The current phase of the peace process, it's said to have begun in September 1993 with the famous White House handshake between Mr. Arafat, Mr. Rabin, and President Clinton presiding. And it came to be called the Oslo peace process. And now 17 years have elapsed. And after 17 years, a rational person stops judging by words and judges by results and outcomes. So in terms of words, day in and day out, we hear about the peace process. The peace process, we have to restart the peace process. We have to jumpstart the peace process. We have to do this with the peace process. We have to have another conference, the peace process, the peace process. That's the words. But now a rational person, as I said, judges by results and outcomes. So what are the results and outcomes? In September 1993, there were 250,000 illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. 17 years later, there are 500,000 illegal Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. The number has doubled. Israel has annexed approximately 43% of the West Bank for the settlements. So if you look at results and outcomes, there hasn't been a peace process. Judging by results and outcomes, there has been an annexation process. What's occurred over the past 17 years is an annexation process. And Israel uses the peace process as a facade behind which it continues the annexation process. In other words, Israel needs the peace process in order to proceed with the annexation process. What does that mean? It's simple. Everybody in here knows it. Whenever Israel is called to account for its transfer of settlers to the occupied territories, its expansion of the settlements, what does Israel say? It says, oh, we'll resolve that in the peace process. It uses the peace process as the facade behind which it continues the inexorable annexation of Palestinian territories. Now, I said there has not been a peace process, there isn't now, and there won't be for the foreseeable future, because the strategy of the Palestinian leadership has always been, beginning with Mr. Arafat, has always been to beg for some crumbs from the Americans. They always believed that they could show their goods, show that they will do what the Americans bidding, that the Americans will give them something. There does seem to be some shift in the strategy of the so-called Palestinian Authority now. I can't say where it's going to go, but there does seem to be a shift. There's a recognition that U.S. power in the region, the Middle East, is on the decline. And that they seem now to be thinking that they may be able to get a state by going around the United States rather than begging the United States. And so, for example, a few months ago, there was an attempt to pass a Security Council resolution condemning the settlement building. And the Americans, Mr. Obama, or as my good friend Loki, the Iraqi British rabbis calls it, abomination. Mr. Obama was very determined not to have that resolution reach the Security Council. And he was very tough with the Palestinians. I mean, he was even on the phone, it was reported, for an hour with Mahmoud Abbas. Now, I would say that's, to have to talk to Mahmoud Abbas for an hour, I would call that a fate worse than death. Rather being Guantanamo Bay than talking to Mr. Abbas. Very hard to talk to a corpse. And he even threatened to cut off money to the Palestinian Authority. But they still went ahead. And now the real contest, as everybody in this room knows, the real contest is now coming in September, where the U.S. is determined that there won't be a UN General Assembly resolution recognizing the Palestinian state. And they're turning all the screws now to prevent Palestinians from going to the UNGA for a vote. But it does seem that they are now amending their strategy by trying to go around the United States and hoping that the United States will do nothing. They know that the U.S. won't support it, but hoping that maybe the U.S. will be intimidated by the international community and do nothing. I can't predict what's going to happen there. But from the Americans, you will get zero. That is plain as day. There's an old adage, I'm a resolute atheist, but as a resolute atheist, I believe God helps those who help themselves. Don't expect anything from the Americans. Don't beg, from Mr. Obama, because he's just so wretched, there are hardly any words to describe him. Yes.
First, I want to commend you for mentioning Mary Robinson, since I have Irish ancestry.
Mentioning
Mary Robinson.
Oh, Mary Robinson.
You also mentioned Jimmy Carter. I want to come back to him in just a second. But I'm also grateful that you had to say what you said about Jews in America, having colleagues and friends who are Jewish. I think sometimes students from other countries don't realize the differences in opinions that exist between American Jews and, say, Jews in Israel. I voted for Jimmy Carter twice, so my question is this. And let me also comment that in America we're seeing denominations, the Methodist, Presbyterians who are taking, I think, positions
That's correct.
on that I think are showing their support for the Palestinians.
That's true.
Regarding Jimmy Carter and regarding Turkey, do you see aspects of what they're doing and what they've had to say, Turkey in particular as a new player, that may, shall we say, be game changers in this?
There are important developments. The Turkish government clearly, unless something goes seriously awry, and something seriously might go awry, but doesn't look like it yet, unless something goes seriously awry, there's going to be a significant change in the Egyptian position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And between Turkey, Egypt, Iran, it's going to be much more difficult now for Israel and the United States to get their way in the region. It doesn't mean they're going to play particularly aggressive roles, but they're not going to support, when I say they, I mean Turkey and Egypt, they simply won't go along with what the U.S. and Israel are doing. There's no possibility they're going to go along with the blockade of Gaza anymore. Turkey has already made clear, again, I can't predict, but as of now, Turkey says it will not prevent the new flotilla from going to Gaza. And Egypt has made clear that they're going to lift the blockade on their side against Gaza. So those are, important developments, but we have to always add qualification. What's happening now in the Muslim Arab world is still a very early stage. And now the counter-revolution has time, has accumulated time, and it's working hard. They were taken by surprise, the Saudis were taken by surprise at the beginning, but now they're working very busily with the Americans to undo the damage. And I don't think they can undo it in Tunisia or Egypt, but elsewhere, it's too soon to tell. It's very unclear. It's not only unclear what's going to happen in Syria, it's unclear what one wants to happen in Syria. That's a big problem, I think. And Bahrain, disaster, Yemen, a lot of plotting, a lot of filthy Saudi maneuvering. It's still in a very early stage. And as I say, I don't think it's going to be undone in Egypt, though they're trying very hard. I don't think it's going to be undone in Egypt. But elsewhere, there are problems. There's no question about that. And I have to say, in my opinion, the most disastrous development, and I'm not meaning it to get a full or a joke, the most disastrous development was that maniac Gaddafi. He wrecked the Arab Revolution. Because up until Gaddafi, even if 2 or 3 civilians were killed in demonstrations, it was major news. But once Gaddafi militarized the conflict, suddenly, unless several hundred were killed, nobody cared. And so he made the non-violent revolts impossible throughout the Arab Muslim world, because the life became meaningless. Once it started entering into the hundreds figures, nobody cared anymore that 20 were killed in Yemen on one day, 30 were killed in Bahrain. Nobody cared. It was him. That guy, you want to just throttle him. What a maniac. What a selfish megalomaniac. The Arab revolt. It was exactly what the Americans wanted, and what the Europeans wanted, and what the Saudis wanted. Direct all attention to Libya, forget about Bahrain, forget about Yemen, direct all the attention to Libya, turn the Americans and the Europeans into heroes, restore their image. It was all him. It was as if you were working for them. That was so terrible. And, now we're facing the consequences. I mean, it's easy enough to talk about the hypocrisy of the West. Now they're talking about they have to go into Syria. And they want to bring Gaddafi, the Syrian regime before the International Criminal Court. Oh, really? They're the only criminals in the Middle East. The only ones. Just Syria. What a happy coincidence. It's wretched and it's hypocritical. It's disgusting, but we shouldn't forget who was in large part responsible for that mess. And it's also, I have to say, the Syrian leadership too. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable what they're doing. What's wrong with these people? I mean, talk about Arab nationalism, Arab pride. And then it's the first time a real assertion of Arab dignity, Muslim dignity. As they said in Egypt, hold your head up high, you're Egyptian. For the first time in 50 years, of these megalomaniacs, these power-hungry megalomaniacs, they have to destroy it. It's so painful to watch. It really is. Excuse me? I can't hear you. It is. Oh, the Gaddafi, they're all on LSD. What a complete freak. What a freak. With his umbrella. The good news was Gaddafi said he's giving up power. The bad news was he said he wasn't leaving until he could pack up his whole wardrobe.
Concerning the upcoming flotilla, is there a possibility, a hint, any talk at all of celebrities joining this flotilla? Like, for example, the elders, Jimmy Carter.
I'm sure they've tried.
Call their bluff.
No, I'm sure they've tried. But the big question is, the Israelis are debating what to do with it. Half the Israelis are saying, just let it pass, and it'll just be ignored by the international community. Just let them go into Gaza, and who cares? And the other half are saying, no, we're not going to let them. So the question is really going to be what the Israeli strategy is going to be.
But the celebrities could make a difference here.
I
The
agree.
elders.
No, I agree with that. They always could make a difference. I totally agree with that. They always make a difference.
I just have a question about the flotilla, the accident. One of the dead was a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
It seems that nobody mentioned it.
It was mentioned, but nothing was done about it.
Yeah, it seems that Israel is always the only country who can get away with things like that.
Yeah, well, they killed Rachel Corrie too, and nobody cared. I mean, many Americans have been killed, and it's just completely ignored. I mean, even the Brits aren't so terrible. When the Israelis killed Tom Herndon, the British government did something, not much. But Rachel Corrie, nothing.
Yes, sir. I just want to tell you guys it's worth the drive from Dallas to here to come and listen.
It's 5 or 10 minutes away.
My question is regarding as you mentioned, the Arab revolt right now, and eventually I'm a PhD student who's going to go back home and teach, and we have a tremendous amount of youth who are witnessing these events, and they just want to know what's the best strategy to be able to engage them in a positive way, because now we have this, like what happened is a strain test where the loyalists are, showing against, the people who are asking for reform, and we're at the point that we don't want the conflict, but the conflict is like we all see it. And what's the best strategy in order to get the best for all the people?
Well, I can't plot and plan strategy for anywhere in the Arab world, but I would want to make one brief comment about it. I think there was a lot of illusion about the social networking, the Facebook and the Twitter. There is no social networking, the Twitter, the Facebook, I've never been on Facebook. I don't know what Twitter is. I've heard there's something called tweeting. I don't know what it is. But those are means of communication. They're obviously very valuable. There's no question about that. And they've done wonderful things. But they will not replace hard work and organization. Some people think all you need is Facebook and Twitter, and you don't have to go through the hard work of meetings, organizing, and so forth. And it's not true. And we saw in Egypt, because about a month and a half ago, maybe it's 2 months, my sense of time is not great anymore, there was the referendum on whether or not to have these new amendments. The whole of the opposition, the Twitter, Facebook opposition, they opposed the amendments because they felt if elections are held too soon, then only the old parties which are organized, only they would be able to field real candidates because the new people weren't yet organized. So all of the Twitter people, all of the Facebook people, people like El Baradei, they all said, vote against the amendments. Vote no. The Muslim Brotherhood, which goes back a long ways and is well organized, they said, vote yes. Now remember, the Muslim Brotherhood, it pretty much sat out the Egyptian revolt until the very end. But what happened? The vote went 80% no. They voted with the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Muslim Brotherhood organizes. It has a long history of deep roots among the people. And when the moment of truth came, they did not vote with the Twitter, Facebook crowd. They voted with the Brotherhood. And that tells me that if you want to have a real impact, you can't, C-A-N apostrophe T, you can't be an employee for Google 90% of the week and do your revolutionary work 10% of the week. It ain't going to happen. You have to be full-time devoted to the cause, like the Brotherhood, or you're going to lose. And that, I think, is a sobering lesson. It was a very sobering lesson about the limits of what's called the social networking. Yes, it achieved a lot, but it also has certain limits against which it comes. And then it's the real organizers with a long history who are the ones who actually promote it. Personally, are there Egyptians in the room? Are there any Egyptians? I don't know your opinion. I would like to see El Baradei in power. I think he's honest. I think he's competent. I think he's dignified. And I think he would set Egypt on the right course. But most people don't think he stands a chance. Who do you want?
Well, either him or Musa, I think.
Oh, please, no more Arab League people. No. Not the Arab League. What about you? The younger fellow, who do you want?
Well, I don't know, they both seem like good candidates, but El Baradei, he's known a lot more in the international community.
You want
El Baradei.
Baradei. I hope he makes it. I mean, he's not great, but he's honest. Everybody says the guy, with this, he's polite, honest, and principled. He just wrote a book. It just came out. I didn't read it yet. I have it sitting on my desk. And he said, for what the Bush administration did to Iraq. They should be brought before the International Criminal Court for war crimes. He doesn't do it in a flashy way. He doesn't make these, bombastic speeches. He just says, that's the law. I'm an international civil servant. They had no right to attack Iraq. That's the law. And he said over and over again, you have no business attacking Iran. That's out. You have no right. And he said that the blockade of Gaza, the Egyptian blockade of Gaza, is a black mark on the Arab people. That's pretty good. Those of you who want Che Guevara and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, no. It's not Che, it's not Lenin, but it ain't bad. There'll be a breath of fresh air in that part of the world. That's how I see it.
Given the aggressive nature of the Israeli military, my main question is, how do they get away with it? Compare their conduct with another country. How did that country get away with it?
I'm perfectly willing to go with you on the horrendous things that Israel does. But I'll tell you, it's not even what Israel does in a year. It's not even what the United States does in an hour. But it's a fact. It's a fact. And it's a very sobering fact, but it's a fact. Let's take a simple example. A simple example. Everybody agrees the Israeli blockade of Gaza in its current phase, it began in late 2007. It's so heartless. It's so merciless, blocking things like chocolate chips, chicks, coriander, paper, pencils. It's horrible. But the fact of the matter is, everything that Israel did in Gaza, they took it, they stole a page from the American playbook. It's exactly what the United States did under Clinton to Iraq. There's a very good book, which I strongly recommend you read, if any of you have the time. It's called Invisible War. Not a difficult title to remember. Invisible War. And the author is a woman named Joy Gordon. And she describes the U.S. sanctions on Iraq. There was this committee in the United Nations, I think it was called the 661 Committee. And countries from around the world were represented. And there was the American representatives on the committee. Everything that came before the committee, water. She quotes the transcripts of the meetings. Water, Americans, blocked. Paper, Americans, blocked. Shirts, Americans, blocked. Glass, Americans, blocked. It's absolutely mindless, insipid American bureaucrat sits on this committee, blocked, blocked, blocked. You start reading this chapter and you feel asphyxiated. You feel like you're gasping. Blocked, blocked, blocked. Just blocking everything. For no reason, just blocking everything. Sounds just like Gaza. But there's one big difference. The book came out from Harvard University Press, so you can be sure Harvard's very careful to check all the details because it doesn't want to be accused of being un-American or whatever. She gives an estimate. She says, I know it's going to be hard to grasp. She says, at minimum, 500,000 Iraqi children were killed. Perhaps as many as 1 million. That's what she says. At minimum, 500,000 Iraqi children were killed by wonderful Mr. Clinton. That's right. every time you see his genial face, remember the corpses. At minimum 500,000, perhaps as many as 1 million Iraqi children. It's not to diminish Israel's crimes, but we should, as Americans, get so carried away with Israel that we forget what our government does every minute of every day, all around the world.
My question is, have you been harassed by Zionists for your speaking out and carrying? And if you have, can you give some examples and explain some methods?
Actually, they say that I harassed them. I don't really like to talk about that stuff, you know. I've seen enough of the world. I know what real suffering is. You know, I've been to the occupied territories in large parts of the world. I know what hunger is. I know what suffering is. I know what death is. I've had a very good life. By comparison, I've had a very good life. I'm already 57. The average life expectancy in Africa is 46. So I've had 13 bonus years by the standards of Africa. I have a roof over my head. I have food. I have decent health. So it would be really shameless of me to sort of advertise my suffering. You know, I've not suffered. I've had a very good life. I haven't had such a good life.
There are a lot of opinions on the Israeli domination in the Middle East. It's the only, militarily mean, it's the only country that possesses nuclear arms, and political means, referring to Michael Miller. He was an advisor of 5 Secretary of States in U.S. governments. He said that on the long run, I see that the U.S. is working as the Israel's lawyer in international law. And also referring to 2 congressmen, one of them is Lee Hamilton. He said that the most effective lobby in Congress is IPAC. Based on those facts and those statements, and both based on the, let's say, the ability of the U.S. to lobby any decision by the UN, how do you see the peace process with this uneven policy taken by the U.S. towards Israel?
Well, it would take me some time to answer that question. I think half of what you say is true, but half of what you say is not true. And I'll try to give you a concrete example. Everybody here, their memories are fresh enough that you recall what happened in Egypt. So when the revolt first began, the U.S. government, Mr. Obama, combination, did whatever he could to keep Mubarak in power. Remember Hillary Clinton's statement that things are stable, no reason to worry. When it looked like when it looked like Mubarak was losing some grip on power, the U.S. position was, let Mr. Mubarak carry on the transition to 6 months transition to a new government. When that didn't wash with the Egyptian people, he then said, let's hand over the power to Omar Suleiman, the torturer-in-chief of Egypt. And then, when that didn't work, then finally the U.S. had to bow to the pressure of the Egyptian people. And Israel, the United States' most important democratic ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, they all were working night and day to keeping Mubarak in power. So it's not as if U.S. Israeli interests in the region conflict. They both want to keep the old regimes into power. it's not just Israel. They both oppose the Arab revolt, as does Saudi Arabia. They both support the repression in Bahrain. They both support the repression in Yemen. They both support the Saudis. So this notion that somehow Israel is working in conflict with American interests and it's only the lobby that accounts for U.S. support of Israel, it's just obviously not true. On most of the regional issues, U.S. and Israeli and Saudi interests are basically the same. But on one point, they aren't the same. And that's the issue of the Palestinians. Because the basic fact is, which is also, in my opinion, perfectly obvious, the U.S. has nothing to gain from the occupation. If tomorrow the Netanyahu government were to announce, we're packing our bags and we're leaving, we're going back to the June 67 border, I'm sure Mr. Obama would be very happy with that. So the U.S. has no strategic interest in Israeli conduct towards the Palestinians. And there, I agree with you, it's the lobby. It's because of the lobby that the U.S. supports Israeli positions on the Palestinians. But on the broader regional picture, no, the American and Israeli and Saudi interests are basically the same.
Okay, just a short comment. What I'm just trying to say is that, like, here in America, a lot of people know, like, our food, but it's not good in politics. Israel has invested for a long time in U.S. politics, and now it's gaining. That's what I'm saying.
It's now what?
Now it's gaining. It's investment. Gaining, it's investment.
Yeah, well, as I said, on certain issues, in particular on the issue of the Palestinians, yes, I think the lobby is very effective. But I don't think you should jump from that fact to assume that U.S.-Israeli interests are always in conflict. No, on most issues, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the interests are the same.
This year, I've heard the flotilla organizers delayed the launch until after the parliamentary elections in Turkey. Some officials in Israel are speculating that this might strengthen the ties between the Turkish government and the organizers. Given a back support from the government, do you think that might influence or have a different outcome?
I wasn't aware of this development. When are the Turkish parliamentary elections?
I'm not sure, but they said mid-June is going to be the next date instead of mid-May.
Oh, it's been moved to mid-June. I wasn't aware of that. Are you sure of that?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
So my question is, given the back support from the Turkish government, do you think that maybe the outcome might be different? Is that a significant?
Well, I think it's true to say. I mean, we shouldn't play games. The Turkish government says they can't do anything because it's a civil society initiative. Obviously, if the Turkish government wanted to, it could, and it won't, because the Turkish government position is it's not fantastic, but it's not bad. They say Israel has to issue an apology for what happened last May 31st. The Turkish are not really asking for very much. They're not asking, for example, for the criminal indictment of the Israeli commandos who murdered the 9 passengers. They're just asking for an apology. I don't even think they've asked for compensation. But the Israelis are just constitutionally incapable of giving an apology. No, they really cannot. It's just completely contrary to their nature. Some of you know the joke. You'll forgive me if you know the joke. It's a joke from the era of the Soviet Union, so the time has passed. But the joke is a journalist, he goes around asking this question. The question is, excuse me, what do you think of the meat shortage? What's your opinion of the meat shortage? So the journalist goes to a Russian, says, excuse me, what's your opinion of the meat shortage? And the Russian says, what's an opinion? Then the journalist goes to a Pole, someone from Poland, says to the Polish fellow, excuse me, what's your opinion of the meat shortage? The Pole says, what's meat? Because there were always meat shortages in Poland during the Soviet era. Then the journalist goes to an Israeli and says to the Israeli, excuse me, what is your opinion of the meat shortage? The Israeli says, what's excuse me? Out of that. So the Turks, their attitude is no apology, then we're going to give a green light to the new flotilla. If the Israelis gave the apology, I think probably the Turkish government would block the flotilla. That's my guess. Okay, folks, parting is such sweet sorrow, but the evening has come to an end, and thank you.